I think it's time we talk about the current events that are happening. Yeah. Hey guys, Deroir here. And as most, if not all of you already know, the last month and a half, we've seen the introduction of small event chains getting sneakily introduced into the world of Tyria. So I figured it was about time we talked about them. We've had 3 updates with 3 different events or clusters of events or whatever we'll call them. Now, first of all, I did heavily consider doing a deep dive with a Mind Spike episode. But in reality, these events aren't really that substantive. They're practically nothing. Sure, they each have their own fun little thematic thingamajig about them, but really there's not much real information to draw from these. So let's instead just discuss these for a bit, because I want to loosely talk about exactly what they, to me, signify for the future of the Gw2 story. So for those of you out of the loop, let me just summarize these 3 events or event clusters and their thematics. The first one we saw was leyline magic seeping out of the ground, to which we, the heroes, rush to stop the dragon minions from trying to absorb this magic. At first there were 3 events, and then gradually these ley lines started popping up at different locations all over the same maps that they were already in, something which Synchrony kept very tight track up on Reddit. These events were curious in and of themselves in that they told the tale of all the loose magic that had seeped into the world from the destruction of Mordremoth. Apparently there's currently enough magic in the ley lines for it to pop out of the ground and stuff. The next chain of events that we saw seemed very thematic with the Forsaken Thicket, the raid, because all of a sudden the Shining Blade started sending us, the heroes as always, out on missions to try and kill bandits. But why, oh why, would the Shining Blade be interested in bandits? Well, of course, because these bandits obviously were heavily affiliated with the White Mantle, which we found deep within the Forsaken Thicket. Now, because of the affiliation with the raid, the question is, why are these bandits all over Kryta when it seems like something big is happening in the jungle? We'll talk about that in a second, but it's curious, right? The third set of current events that we got last week was an extension of the leyline events. But this time it's not about the dragon minions. Instead, the Priory, the Consortium, and the Inquest all want a piece of the cake that is leyline magic. And so they're trying to harvest the magic for various very unspecified reasons. Now, just to point out one thing that really caught my attention with these events specifically, it seems that visually, to show off this harvest of leyline magic, basically what we see is that the leyline magic is manifested into a living being, which is the thing that we harvest. And a lot of you guys know exactly what my theory about large-scale magical fusion is and what it potentially creates. Life. If you want, go ahead and check out some of my old videos about the subject, but I won't go too much into that right now. In short, this event just furthers my personal theory on the matter, which I obviously find very awesome. Anyways, like I mentioned just a minute ago, these events don't really tell much in and of themselves. Sure, we know that there are bandits affiliated with the White Mantle, they have their badges, they have their weapons, they have their customary naming in place. And sure, the leyline events are curious, but none of it really tells us anything. It's all just a mix of research and bounty hunting. And so all of it practically is nothing more than just a tease for something. And so obviously everyone and their grandma believes it to be a tease for the season 3 of the Living Story. Now, I'm not necessarily going to dispute this, but really, there is no evidence that says so. We assume it to be the Living Story tease because, well, it's in the open world. It makes sense to build the groundwork for the scene for the story yet to come, to slowly tease the upcoming story. But honestly, it might as well just be a tease for the final raid wing. All in all, the Forsaken Thicket has more to do with the thematics of the current events than does dragons, which I guess most people assume would be the main focus of the next story. But again, why are the mantle then in Kryta and not in the jungle, seeing as it seems like right around the corner something big is about to happen? Or has it already happened? Without us, the heroes, to witness it? Oh my goodness. Currently what we believe to be happening in the jungle is that the White Mantle is trying to resurrect an entity known as Lazarus the Dire, the last Mursat. And so, just hypothetically, if they were still trying to do that, why wouldn't they just be fortified inside some bunker somewhere in the jungle? But then again, why would the raid story seep into the open world? I thought the stories were supposed to be separate. I'm waltzing around the point here, so let's get to it. Regardless of the strong affiliation with the raid story, I personally believe that the current events indeed do signify the beginning of the Living Story Season 3. But exactly because of this affiliation with the raid story, I also believe that the conclusion of the Forsaken Thicket raid will have a much more prominent role in the Living Story to come. I've said this before, and I'll stand by it. I don't believe that we'll fight Lazarus the Dire in the third raid wing. Despite it being a very likely conclusion to the raid, killing him so soon would greatly compromise the value that such a character might hold in the future if he was just a simple encounter at the end of a long string of hints. Regardless of how strong these insinuations have been from ArenaNet's side throughout the raid that perhaps Lazarus is awakening, would he not feel extremely irrelevant if all he was at the end was just another encounter? I think the reason why the Mantle are already in Kryta is because when we get to the end of the Forsaken Thicket, we'll find that Lazarus is alive and already working on his plans to overthrow the Krytan Kingdom. Think about it. As it stands, ArenaNet have practically cornered themselves in terms of storytelling, in the sense that they have effectively created not one, but 6 villains who are simply forces of nature, the Elder Dragons. Narratively, these types of villains have the potential to confront the consumer of the narrative with primal aspects of society or themselves. But as we've seen, and as I believe most of you can attest to, these forces of nature are also extremely hard to design narratively as villains, as they are more akin to representations of some primal evil than they are actual characters. Thus, villains like these can be very hard for consumers to identify with. Identification with or understanding of characters, and especially villains, is an extremely powerful tool in narrative storytelling to engage the consumer and to give these characters depth. I mean, Mordramoth just wanted to take over the world, you know, because without motive, without desires and personality, as a player and a consumer of the narrative, forces of nature will more than likely fall flat. And so how does one counter this obvious dilemma? Well, as one example that ArenaNet has already explored, you can create side villains like Scarlet Briar, an actual character with feelings and desires and motive. I don't want to hear any shit about Scarlet being a shitty villain, because whether or not it was executed correctly, which it wasn't at the early stage of their narrative development in the Living Story, she was still conceptually much more engaging than any of the Elder Dragons we've encountered to date. Still, one of the biggest problems with introducing side villains into a world where there are godly forces of nature is that simultaneously you run the risk of undermining him immediately, because we have already killed 2 of these godly forces of nature. And so for a character to really feel intimidating, you need something more than just power. Now, to return to the subject of the next season of the Living Story, I highly believe that Lazarus will be the main antagonist of this next installment. Why? Because he has power, potentially much more power than we ever saw in Guild Wars 1. He has motive. He wants to kill every Crichton. He wants to overtake the Crichton throne. He wants to avenge the heroes that once slayed his entire race. But also, most importantly, because the community want him to be that villain. As Devin Ferrisy writes in his article, Fandom is Broken, fans and consumers of the universes that we partake in have much more power to alter its future than we've ever had. These simple utterances that you see on forums, on YouTube videos, or whatever is what helps the creators, the developers, shape these worlds. Effectively, this can be a very effective thing for consumers, but whether or not it's a good or bad thing for the developers is a larger discussion than I want to go into right now. But regardless, ever since the introduction of Silver Waste and the introduction of the first hints for the White Mantle themselves and the activity, there have been community-wide screams about bringing back the old story. And so why wouldn't ArenaNet grab this opportunity with both hands? A lot of players want it, so much so that there has been outcries everywhere about the coolest story of Guild Wars 2 taking place in a raid, inaccessible to a lot of players. So why not take this story and bring it out into the open world? In the end, because of the nostalgia attached to the community screams for Mersat and the White Mantle, ArenaNet only really have to create a somewhat decent narrative, yet people will hail it as being fantastic. I'm not saying they'll necessarily stick to the bare minimum. Don't misinterpret me at all here, alright? They probably will make it quite spectacular. To begin with, they've at least got an amazing setup for the story to take shape from. Remember that little weird side note of information that we got during season 2 of The Living Story where some NPCs just super casually mentioned some artifact that she was transporting which would help tell the true heir of the Crichton throne? Of course, when we found this thing, we all thought that a dragon or something similar was going to kill the queen back then, which, to be fair, might even have been ArenaNet's plan from the very beginning. But in light of all these happenings over the last months, this artifact will probably be used quite cleverly. So here's my prediction for season 3 of The Living Story. I believe at the end of the Forsaken Thicket, we'll find Lazarus. Will probably be too late to stop the ritual or whatnot, and he'll escape or something. This will start off the first season with an ominous threat looming over our heads. With the corrupt Crichton government, the queen will probably be overthrown by the White Mantle and result in a destabilized human government, which gives way for this artifact to have some significance somewhere, somehow, for our heroes to reinstate the new true heir to the Crichton throne. But only once the threat is dealt with, of course. But in the meanwhile, we're going to have to deal with Lazarus and the White Mantle, all the while the dragons gobble up more magic, which probably results in a giant dragon attack by the very end of the season, which kicks off the setup for the next expansion. I know I'm making very broad strokes here because, again, we practically have nothing to go off of. Now, even though this sounds alright for me, there's only one thing that nags me about the possibility of Lazarus being a living story boss somewhere down the line. Last Friday, I talked with my good friend Particular about difficulty in Guild Wars 2. Amongst many things, we discussed the necessity or lack thereof for lore within the raids. And so on that video, Mr. Rob Byers left a very interesting comment on the topic. In it, he spoke as a raider and a person not particularly interested in the narrative or the lore. He explained how he found the living story to be boring, emotionless, and easy, thus resulting in him struggling to actually getting engaged in the scene at hand. Now, I'll read this next part for you all verbatim as he expands. Now, raids are the perfect medium for these encounters, and they have really opened my eyes to the Guild Wars lore. Something about beating a super challenging boss makes me very interested in the backstory behind the encounter. Like, why is there a giant spirit manifestation blocking my way to a bandit leader with a freaking flamethrower? The idea here that Rob presents is practically forced immersion for the player, provoked by the engagement of the challenge itself, wherein because you spent so much time with the character, with the villain, or the boss at hand. You find yourself growing more curious about it. The exact same thing happens with characters or villains like Scarlet, that we spend so much time trying to beat or track down or whatever. But oftentimes, and especially in MMOs, you find that prolonged narratives run the risk of including mindless and completely redundant details simply to prolong the narrative and nothing more. But because the lore is so minimal and direct with the raid bosses, we never really risk getting to that point. Personally, I actually have a very similar opinion to Rob on the matter, but till I read his comment, I hadn't really realized. And so the problem that I see with the prospect of having Lazarus the Dire as a living story villain is exactly the fear that he might become bland and boring and emotionless, like the majority of all characters that we've seen. I would personally hate to see Lazarus become just another stupid world boss event set on a timer. Also, to a certain degree, I think a lot of us have spent so much time in the raids that we sort of deserve the honors of taking him down. I fully realize that that sounds very egocentric from the standpoint of a raider, but to be honest, I'd rather have Lazarus be a tough motherfucker than I would have him destroyed by the blandness of the living story. Perhaps he'll simply overtake the Wizard's Tower and camp in there for the next raid. I mean, one can hope, right? I'd love to hear your thoughts and ramblings on the subject in the comment section down below. But for now, I think I rambled long enough for a subject that I introduced as practically nothing. So thank you all for watching. Until next time, I will see you in the mists.